Human nature is infinitely complicated.
Do you think every victim has to take some responsibility for what happened?
We all make choices. We take responsibility for our choices. And until you actually wake up to why you do it, and it took me a very long time to realize some of the choices I made. And then I realized, far too late, my father was such a brilliant man for all the terrifying monster he was in many ways. I really, really enjoyed listening to him because he was an old China hand. He was an Arabist. I mean, he was all sorts of things. And I looked for that sort of man without even realizing it, and which is fairly disastrous. And I think for all of us, yeah. What do they say? An unexamined life is not worth living. So I think we all have to. And most of all, we need to be trained from a very young age about how we make relationships and why we make relationships. Not just about sex, but they don't teach relationships in schools.
We met with a domestic violence victim this morning in San Diego and interviewed him for a few hours. And I found his first few months of beginning to date this girl very questionable in his choices. And as much as I wanted to feel sorry for him and say, yes, you are a male victim of domestic violence, I found myself victim blaming, which is part of rape culture, if you've heard.
Yeah, because I've always been told that I'm victim blaming. No, in many cases, again, it goes back to that thing. There are people who are innocent victims of their partner's violence. They quite genuinely really fall headlines for somebody and then find, my God, he's a raving psychopath. And you can't pick those out. I don't care how practiced you are. But the majority are women that I've said who are victims of their own violence, and their choices are based from their own childhood damage. Now you'll find an awful lot of men going for narcissistic women. Because the man himself has very bad image of himself, he's had probably an extremely damaging relationship with his mother. And what does he do? He goes out, and the girl who's in the center of the room getting all the attention, everybody wants to be with her, that's the one he'll pick. He never asked himself why he does that. And it's disastrous. He is responsible for his decision. Of course he is. And I don't let people off the hook any more than I let me off the hook. You know, we are. The choices we make bring consequences into our lives. And the tragedy is when people don't even think that they actually get involved with a dangerous, violent person. And I look at them and say, and you chose to have children with him? What have you done to your children? You've landed them in this situation. And they look at you because they've never even thought that they have a responsibility of choosing a parent who is not going to be dangerous to the child. See, I come from a time for all the things that wasn't right. Families knew each other. And I remember the first man I was really attracted to, Miss Williams was sitting, because we used to be chaperoned in my day. You didn't go out on dates or any of that sort of thing until you were about 102. But I remember her sitting there, and I was dancing with this very divine young man. She called me over and she said, "You're never dancing with him again, Erin." And I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Bad blood," because she knew the family. And actually, she turned out to be right. But families did know each other, you know, and people, and in a sense, you know, it wasn't the Asian idea of an arranged marriage, but to an extent it was arranged. Because, and actually in my time, if it was a professional man marrying a woman, she had to come and meet the people that he was working for. It was far more regulated than it is now. Because the fact and the truth is, you don't just get involved with a man. He gets him, you get him involved, and you get involved with his family, and he gets involved with your family. And then what can happen to so many families is if he turns out to be extremely violent and dangerous, you decimate your family. How many mothers, you know, fathers are beside themselves knowing that their children are being harmed, and their grandchildren. Nobody even considers them. They don't have any rights.
Yeah, I do find myself questioning the choices of some of these victims.
Well, they're not victims. You have to tell them. Well, you can't tell them that. I'd tell them that. I'd simply say, stop it. No, it's your choice and your consequence. And I'm certainly will sympathise, but I won't let them tell me that they're victims, because they're not. Any more than I would with the women, because they would come in seeing themselves as victims. You know, he did this, he did that, he did that, and then I'd just say to them, and you? What was your part? Because you see, what I knew from the beginning, like most domestic violence, is consensual. Both are involved. Sometimes one's the perpetrator, the other plays the victim, then it crosses over. It's not as though it's just all men or all women. It's both. And occasionally innocent victims, very innocent. But they're the ones that are going to be all right, because they're whole. Most of them have come from good, warm, loving families, and they can move on. The people who get so incredibly damaged and don't see themselves as anything other than victims are those that have been there from their whole lives. That's why it was important when I did questionnaires to look at 3 generations, because you could see where it was coming from. But you see, one of the things I think was very difficult with the men is so many times you're talking to the walking wounded because they haven't healed themselves. And you have that also, you know, when women have come from extremely burning backgrounds. And until they actually have dealt with what's happened to them and been able to make some peace within themselves, they do more harm than good. Because they're talking, is this women's thing, they always said, the personal is political. Well, actually, no, it isn't. In fact, my father and mother were dysfunctional, doesn't make all men and women dysfunctional. And I feel that's my message to the men as well. The fact, at the end of the day, it was your choice. It was my choice, the marriages I made, they didn't work out. Whatever the reason is, I'm responsible for my choice, and the same for men. So I would want, and I tend to work with men who, to a certain extent, have reached a position where, like Warren, they can be able to mediate their personal needs and the needs to make a movement that is going to bring harmony, hopefully, eventually to all of us.
But yeah, I just had a epiphany with you saying that, you know, the feminists that are men hating are really hurting.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Absolutely. Walking wounded. And some of them were wounded from before they were born. And if we would only begin to take time to understand what actually happens to a child when they're exposed to this sort of thing.